Section 2, the cognitive self. So let's start with cognitive theories of the self. David Rose points out that a central theme in modern cognitive psychology is that our knowledge of the outside world is fallible. It's based on mental models of the way the outside world is. By analogy, he says, our self-knowledge arises in the same way. In other words, we construct a mental model of the self. Quote, through individual growth, you build up knowledge about yourself, your self-identity, behavior patterns, likes and preferences, what you do, how you think, and so on. The unity of yourself centers around the single concept or model you thus form of yourself. End quote. Rose is keen to point out that this self-model has no special status over your other mental models, and like them, it can contain errors and mistakes. Quote, this model is no different in kind from the mental models you have of other people and objects in the environment. It is qualitatively similar in the sense that it is just another mental model. And when you think of yourself, you are gaining access to that mental model. Your consciousness or awareness of yourself involves processing information in that mental model of yourself. The model is not necessarily an accurate reflection of yourself. Errors, mistakes, and illusions about yourself can creep into the model. End quote. Again, in this cognitive version of the self, the model that represents it is simply another part of your mind. It is composed by the rest of your mind. The self-model has no capacity to survey or comprehend the entire mind. And so, Rose says, quote, the knowledge you have of yourself is not directly linked to the main functional states. It is a special functional module, a collection of mental states that you have built up. But each state is the same type as any other representation. End quote. But the mental states in the self-model are different from ordinary representational states. Quote, in some, there are two stages. So, in a sense, you have two categories of mental states. Mental states that you use when you are navigating the world, seeing red, feeling sad, etc. And then another level that may represent what you think of yourself, what you are aware of within yourself. End quote. David Rosenthal and others have elaborated these ideas into a higher order thought theory of consciousness and the self. According to Rose, they claim that, quote, higher or second order thoughts are those creating consciousness of the contents of first order sensory experience. Brackets, I think I am seeing red. This theory is easily extended to account for introspection, which occurs when there are third-order thoughts. These are thoughts or knowledge about second-order states. For example, they may contain the content, "I know that I think I am seeing red." Thus, there is a third layer of representation that is about the existence of second-order representations, end quote. This third-order category of thought provides our experience of having a self. But as Rose points out, Rosenthal specifically denies an infinite regress of higher orders of thought, quote. Note that Rosenthal denies that any further fourth order and so on layers exist. So there is no infinite regress of higher and higher thoughts. Although one can state, I know, I am hearing a piano, this does not describe how the mind actually works. We can at times think we are now conscious of seeing something red or hearing a piano, but we do not introspect our introspections, end quote. As above, many biological theories of the self incorporate elements of the cognitive approach. For example, Edelman argues that, quote, once higher order consciousness begins to emerge, a self can be constructed from social and affective relationships. This self, entailing the development of a self-conscious agent, a subject, goes far beyond the biologically based individuality of an animal with primary consciousness, end quote. Clearly, for Edelman, the primary consciousness of animals is not enough to constitute a self. Although rooted in human primary consciousness, the self has to be constructed by human higher order consciousness. And this construction process involves building the self out of specifically human capacities, such as language and culture, quote. The emergence of the self leads to a refinement of phenomenological experience, tying feelings to thoughts, to culture, and to beliefs. It liberates imagination and opens thought to the vast domains of metaphor. It can even lead to a temporary escape while still remaining conscious from the temporal shackles of the remembered present. Three mysteries, that of ongoing awareness, that of the self, and that of the construction of stories, plans, and fictions, can be clarified, if not completely dispelled, by considering a combined picture of primary and higher order consciousness, end quote. In a later passage, Edelman makes his proposed mix of biology and culture explicit, quote, the notions of primary consciousness and higher order consciousness allow us to consider a mix. An animal with just primary consciousness that lacks symbolic capabilities has no possibility of developing a notion of a self, of time past, of time future, unlike humans. Apes do not appear to be compelled toward language in their native environment and do not seem to be able to master syntax, end quote. So animals can't have even a primitive self because they lack language. In the case of human babies, however, quote, higher order consciousness, a self-concept, and a notion of past and future emerge rapidly with language and socialization. The baby is constructing his or her own scenes via primary consciousness, and that these scenes rapidly begin to be accompanied by the refurbishment of concepts through gesture, speech, and language. From the earliest times, the thought that accompanies language and that flowers with its development is likely to be metaphorical and narrative. A child can play house with an imaginary companion and make up entire scenarios in which roles and properties are attributed to all kinds of objects, end quote.